thank you all for coming here this afternoon for the official launch of the Stella Prize Schools programme. The Stella Prize was established in 2012 to celebrate Australian women's contribution to literature and has been awarded twice to date. In 2013 to Carrie Tiffany for her second novel, Mateship with Birds, and this year to Claire Wright for her history book, The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. The Stella Prize grew out of an awareness that women writers were underrepresented in three key areas: as winners of literary prizes, on the literary pages of the mainstream media, both in terms of books reviewed and as reviewers, and on school curricula reading lists. For example, this year of the VCE English list of approved books, almost 70% are by male authors. It was in response to that last point that the Stella Prize Schools programme was devised. It aims to provide role models for girls, encourage the inclusion of more text by Australian women on school syllabi, and promote wider reading of books by female authors among both boys and girls. We are very aware at the Stella Prize at how early gendered reading habits are established and become entrenched for life, and how those then play into unconscious bias. The Stella Prize Schools programme includes school visits by notable Australian writers, educators and publishers, hands-on writing workshops, and teaching notes on all Stella Prize shortlisted books, and ideas on how to analyse the gender dynamics and the gendered marketing of books that students read. If you didn't collect a copy of the Stella Prize education kit, please do so on your way out. Lastly, but very importantly, I want to thank the key sponsors of the Stella Prize Schools programme, without whom we wouldn't have got this Victorian pilot programme up and running. We are extremely grateful to the Readings Foundation, and especially Mark Rubo, a Stella supporter from the very start, and to Kerry Gardner and Andrew Meyer of the Andy Inc. Foundation. And now I'd like to hand over to the wonderful Bec Kavanagh, Stella Prize Schools Coordinator Extraordinaire, and our wonderful panellists. Thank you.
Thanks, Aviva. Okay, hi everyone. I am here today. I'll just introduce the panellists. I'm here today with Cate Kennedy, whose book of short stories Like a House on Fire was shortlisted for the Stella Prize in 2013. She is also the award-winning novelist of The World Beneath, I'm shocking with names, Kate, and several poetry collections and other short story collections. Tony Birch was one of the Stella Prize judges this year, and his most recent book is The Promise. And Leanne Hall is a young adult author who won the Text Prize for her first book, The Queen of the Night, This is Shyness, and the sequel was The Queen of the Night. Thanks all for coming. I would like to open with a quote by Tony, which was in an article that he wrote on the Stella Prize. The narrative that has developed since the Stella's foundation, be it through media, publicity, festival events and commentary, has promoted a discussion that would otherwise never have surfaced. And so what I guess we're here today for, aside from launching this great schools kit, is to launch that discussion and start that narrative in schools about the gender bias and about gendered reading, and to try and give you some ideas of measures that you can implement to strategies to combat that. I'm going to read some stats and then let's talk about your feelings on the gender bias. As Aviva mentioned, around 70% of novels on the Victorian curriculum at the moment is written by men. And worldwide, the stats are kind of harder to find because, as many of you would know, children's and YA fiction is often categorised very differently depending on who's talking. But they all paint the same kind of picture, and so one collection shows that 57% of children's books published each year have male protagonists versus 31% of female. In popular children's books featuring animated animals, 100% have male characters and only 33% have female. And a really great example of this is a classic that everybody still reads, like Winnie the Pooh, where there's only one female character in the entire story, and that's Kanga, and she's certainly not one of the central gang. It was also interesting that I read an article with a little anecdote about a mother who said that her little child, every time they were playing with little animals, tended to call it a he, or, when kids are animating toys. So this is how early these issues start. And finally, the average number of books featuring male characters in the title of the book is 36.5 versus 17.1 for female characters. So let's start by just what do you guys understand about the gender bias? Like, what are your thoughts on what it is? Let's run across, just to throw you in the deep end, Kate. What are your thoughts on what the gender bias is?
I think there's it's like a thing where there's a normal and then there's the rest. And I think when we have this kind of stripe of normal, which is a pretty broad stripe, mostly I think that seems to be male, and that's male becomes the normal, and then the other part becomes the novelty. That's how I would probably try and define that bias. And so it's invisible to us until we're actually kind of shocked into looking at something like a statistic. And then and suddenly it's very evident to us. And that is the most insidious thing, I think, about something like gender bias, is that when I was at school, I went to a Catholic private school, we did not study a single female author. It was an all-girls school. And we would do things like study Ted Hughes but not Sylvia Plath, for example. So it actually decontextualised texts in order to kind of make sure that stripe was in place very firmly. And it didn't even occur to me that was happening until I went to university. It didn't even strike me that was odd. And yet I was a fairly well-read child in Year 12, and I really loved writing. I read all those things in my own life, but they just weren't taught to us. So that invisibility to me is part of the whole problem of that bias, because nothing is more powerful than something that we take so much for granted that we don't even look at it,
That's right, and I mean, I guess that's why it's called the unconscious bias, is that it happens so much without any of us realising it.
Yeah.
Tony, what are your thoughts?
Well, I suppose in a practical sense, it's how acutely aware you become of it as a writing teacher at a university level. So that, I mean, Kate's so right about, basically what is normal. So what is normal you don't question, so that's just the way it is. But when you start to teach students at a university level, and I think about 70% of my students would be female, and I think as someone, and partly in my eyes being opened by the discussion around the Stella, is being committed to redressing and questioning this so-called normal, is that what you find immediately that happens when you start to put more female authors on your course teaching, and particularly teaching short fiction, several things happen. Is that those young women that you're teaching see women who are publishing in around contemporary ideas, so that there's both material that they're influenced by. They're certainly influenced by these other women who are published as mentors, and that's absolutely vital. But it's quite interesting to watch. One of my favourite short story writers to teach is actually the Irish writer Anne Enright, and it's really interesting when you teach a writer like Enright discussing, say, domestic relationships, marital relationships, failed love relationships. The discussion that you have in a class with both male and female students changes the way that you've been discussing these issues previously. So what, as an educator, is so important to me is that you actually get clearly, the other thing about, as Kate says, with normal, is that you have a narrow parameter of which to discuss important contemporary issues. And when you have displaced that and you have new voices and different approaches, you actually change the way you discuss those issues. And for me, the greatest revelation of doing Stella judging, and of course because you're reading so many books by women in a pretty concentrated time, and maybe this is another issue of normal, you may not notice it so much with one book here and there. I was just struck by the way, when people say, do women write differently than men, one of the things I would say is that in all of the books I read, the way that women write about the family, domesticity, is far more complex and raises many more questions than the way that men generally have written about that issue. So to me, that was a real revelation, and a real refreshing revelation.
I think I'll answer the question as a reader and writer, similar to Kate. I don't think that I really became aware of my own unconscious bias in my reading habits until I reached university. So despite the fact that I would have called myself a feminist from a very young age, it wasn't until I was at university that I realised actually that I was reading predominantly men. So I guess at that time, first, second year of university, I had a secret ambition of being a writer, and I kind of wanted to read all the cool, young, gritty, very fashionable literary authors at the time, and they just all happened to be men. And so I was solidly reading male authors for several years before I pulled myself up on it. And once I did that, I became very embarrassed and ashamed. And I think when talking about gender bias and the unconscious nature of gender bias, an immediate instinctual reaction is to get quite defensive about it, to feel guilty about it, and to feel awful that you've played a part in perpetuating it yourself. And I really caught myself doing it, and I think it affected my ability to start a career as a writer, because I felt as a young female that I actually didn't have a story to tell, or that the stories I really desperately wanted to tell were of no interest to the world. And it's no wonder I felt that way if I was only reading these hip young male authors. I didn't really feel like there was a place for my kind of stories that were too young and too female.
Well, then a question to you, Cate, and you, Leanne. What difficulties have you found as becoming writers in terms of the subject matter that you've addressed, the way that that's been received? Why is it necessary for women writers to be accepted and acknowledged in this way? What struggles have you had?
Just wanted to start by talking about something that you just said, Leanne. I completely understand that thing of being at university and reading men and thinking that is going to be my aspiration. Or else, that thing about being embarrassed, making it your own problem, that thing of we silence ourselves. We don't need someone to silence us. We're really good at self-oppression, I think, generally. We don't need someone to tell us we haven't got any publishing future, or we have to change our subject matter, because we're very, very good at making sure we don't do any more writing. And that was my story for sure. I mean, if you look at, I was pretty much... I did a degree in professional writing that I finished when I was 20, and I didn't begin writing again after that until I was 35. So I had 15 years of feeling like I had no story to tell. That's very true. And in lots of ways, I was green as grass. In lots of ways, I was a very callow... I look at it now and think about the kind of life you need to live to actually have your subject matter shown to you, I suppose. It's hard to find that. It's a slippery thing, and I think I do meet lots of young people in school who are trying to write, and it's easy to kind of say, look how derivative this is, look how much TV they watch, look, they're trying to write like a 35-year-old Californian divorcee. Why can't you write your story? It's easy for us to say that. We're adults. We've done stuff in our lives. We have material. Their material is pretty much lives second-hand, and the things, that complexity of domestic life you mentioned too, Tony, where kids want to think about relationships. They want to... They are going to get their hearts broken. They are going to stumble into things. They're going to be out of control of the work-life balance, the same as all of us are. That is all ahead of them, and they want to have something there which is going to be what we all need, which is why we read, which is, here's a beautiful template, or here's a kind of a prism through which someone with compassion and thoughtfulness and care has shown us.
That idea of there's somebody out there like us as well.
So my answer, I guess, is that your subject matter kind of finds you, depending on the sort of life that you're living. And it may be that you don't write for years. Maybe we shouldn't be so tough on ourselves and just say that's the way it's going to go. Because personally, because I had that big silence of 15 years, and I did all kinds of jobs, which I write about all the time in my work. Many of my stories are pretty much autobiographical, because things happen to you which later they may feel incoherent, but let's face it, we're all writing stories because it makes our lives more coherent. We all read because it makes our lives feel more coherent. We're all looking for those blueprints and those kind of templates to think about. To me, I would have to say I haven't experienced, in a narrow writing context, any discrimination as a writer, because I feel like I began late when I was more confident of my footing in that world, and I had nothing to lose. There wasn't anything... The other battles in work and life and relationships, that kind of feminist sort of thing that you're struggling to find your own way in, it didn't really seem to have anything to do with my writing life. But having said that, as I said, I can't remember in school being conscious of those things because I was young and I hadn't been in the world in that way. So to me, I guess your subject matter finds you, and then it's your job now to shape that into something. And that, to be that agent of creating something that is shaped for an audience, where you have a worldview, you have an idea about compassion or an idea about relationships, that takes a certain gender and cultural confidence, which is a lived experience, I think. And I want to read those stories. And I want those young girls to be able to write about things, how it's feeling to be 16, you know. I want to read those things, to see how they're finding their way in that stuff. You know?
Absolutely.
I similarly can't think of any specific instance or example that I could use to say that I felt somehow stymied in becoming a writer because of gender reasons. And I don't know whether I've never really discussed this with anyone, but in some way it's sort of, because I write for young adults and also write for children, in some way it's quite acceptable for women to write for young adults and children in a way that may not... I've never really thought about too much. It could be something we could discuss, but it's kind of fairly normal for women to write for children and young adults. So in that way I feel very, very normal amongst my peers. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but, you know, my first publications of short stories were as a result of encountering women publishers or women editors. And I certainly felt like my style of work was more welcomed by female editors very early on in my career. So one of my first short stories that I got published was for Sleepers Publishing, which is headed up by two women. And it was about a very bored, bitchy 20-something retail shop assistant in a fashion store. And, you know, I can think of lots of places that story would not be welcome and wouldn't have been published, but it was the first email I'd ever got from somebody saying, wow, we really like your style of writing. And similarly, you know, being in the Growing Up Asian in Australia anthology, when I saw the call out for submissions for that, I thought, oh God, I better not mess this up, because if I can't write a story about this, then I may as well give up now. And it's got Alice Pung as an editor, and I loved Alice's book Unpolished Gem. And I thought, if I fuck this up, then I just, you know, oh, let's give up writing altogether. It was like the first time I felt invited to and allowed to be exactly who I was as a young woman and contribute a piece of writing.
It's just a comment on that. It is interesting that you should say that you feel really at home amongst other young adult authors, because there are so many women in Australia writing for young adults. And I'd just like to comment on that, because that's certainly true, and I think that in a way it's dangerous, not dangerous, but it adds to the issue in Australia because there are so many female YA authors, because that makes us almost think that, well, you know, there's heaps of female YA authors, so is this an issue? Like, why is something like the Stella Schools program necessary? And the two comments that I would like to make about that are that firstly, well, three actually. Firstly, those women are still not getting studied in schools. And so although the books are out there, it is actually necessary for students often to find them themselves. And they're not being put on book lists and curriculum lists, and so there's still that kind of idea that female writers are for recreational reading, but not for, you know, literary merit. In addition to that, I mean, Kirsty Murray was talking at our Melbourne Writers Festival schools program, Melbourne Writers Festival event, saying that she went to see a class of Year 10s, and one of the girls came up to her and said, "Oh, I had no idea that there were women writing in Australia," which is just baffling to me, and I think to other people who are in the industry, because we do surround ourselves with, you know, with other female authors, so it doesn't seem as big of an issue. And the final point, I guess, is that the prizes for young adults, so the Inkies, the CBCA Awards, even the international prizes like the Newbery and the Carnegie, do show that the split of winners is fairly even. So it's about 50%. But having said that, if you look at the uneven split of the number of female authors to the number of male authors, and the number of female authors writing in young adult and children's fiction significantly outnumbers the number of male authors, and yet they're still winning about the same amount of prizes. So that's a gender imbalance in itself, and that really adds to that subtlety of this unconscious bias. I think now might be a good time to show the video that I've brought, because it starts highlighting some of, you know, the early issues that we have with the gender bias. Right. And then we'll talk about more.
Hi, Erin.
Hi.
Okay, so I'm going to just give you some actions to do. And just do the first thing that comes to mind. Show me what it looks like to run like a girl.
My hair. Oh my God.
Show me what it looks like to fight like a girl. Now throw like a girl.
Aww. My name is Dakota, and I'm 10 years old.
Show me what it looks like to run like a girl. Throw like a girl. Fight like a girl. What does it mean to you when I say run like a girl?
It means run fast as you can.
So do you think you just insulted your sister?
No. I mean, yeah, insulted girls, but not my sister.
Is like a girl a good thing?
Actually, don't know if it's a bad thing or a good thing. It sounds like a bad thing. It sounds like you're trying to humiliate someone.
So when they're in that vulnerable time between 10 and 12, how do you think it affects them when somebody uses like a girl as an insult?
I think it definitely drops their self-confidence and really puts them down, because during that time they're already trying to figure themselves out, and when somebody says you hit like a girl, it's like, well, what does that mean? Because they think they're a strong person. It's kind of like telling them that they're weak and they're not as good as them.
And what advice do you have to young girls who are told they run like a girl, kick like a girl, hit like a girl, swing like a girl?
Keep doing it, because it's working. If somebody else says that running like a girl or kicking like a girl or shooting like a girl is something that you shouldn't be doing, that's their problem. Because if you're still scoring and you're still getting to the ball on time and you're still being first, you're doing it right. Doesn't matter what they say. I mean, yes, I kick like a girl and I swim like a girl and I walk like a girl and I wake up in the morning like a girl because I am a girl. And that is not something that I should be ashamed of. So I'm going to do it anyway. That's what they should do.
If I asked you to run like a girl now, would you do it differently?
I would run like myself.
Would you like a chance to redo it?
Yeah.
Why can't run like a girl also mean win the race?
So I love that video. It sort of went viral on the internet a while ago. And I just think it really sums up what we're talking about here. What are the dangers of the gender imbalance? What message is it sending to people?
Well, I've got 4 daughters, 30 to 16, and I'm really intrigued by it because it is the... and Cate said something really early about, again, about normal and not questioning. One of the things that you battle as a parent is that, my girls are quite assertive. My older girls, they take no prisoners. But what's interesting, and I think the internet, the web is playing a role here, and obviously going viral, it can be a positive influence. But I noticed with my younger daughters who are 18 and almost 17, whatever, they see the behaviour of their sisters and their mother as their role models, but there are a lot of external pressures for them, and in a way, that the girl who says, well, now run like yourself, what I see in my 16-year-old daughter Nina is a lot of, pressure that it seems to come from herself, but out of these influence where she's questioning her assertiveness, and you can see her sometimes wanting to withdraw. So whether she would get shit from a boy at school to you're talking too much or whatever, but a lot of it is a sort of restraining herself because she might not be fitting what is one dominant image, which is one of the things we're talking about at Bec is the whole way that there's another level of girls to be girly in that negative sense. So I see her battling that all the time, and as much as, whatever I would say, or again her sisters or her mother would say, there's a lot of peer pressure or a lot of pressure around that age group, which is, I think young girls feel really, sort of pushed around about that, and they do need someone to say, no, the way you're going is the right way to go. It is. I think this is a related point. We're talking about the statistics that you were talking about. One of the things that interests me here, a relative point, but in the Aboriginal community, those statistics, I don't know how they would pan out, but what is interesting is that if you look at the really important writers in the Aboriginal community and accepted widely in the Aboriginal community, there are male writers, but female writers is to the fore, and they're female writers writing really really important stuff, quite aggressive, in the sense of punchy stuff, taking up the big issues like Melissa Lukashenko, Alexis Wright, a young new writer who's fantastic, Ellen Van Nerven. If you look at the content of their books, they are seen as the premier writers in the Aboriginal community and being celebrated that way. And that's interesting in the sense of the younger girls who they're representing in their fiction. I saw Ellen at the Brisbane Writers' Festival, and you could see the younger Murray Aboriginal girls really gravitating to her, and that positive influence of those writers in the Aboriginal community is profound.
And that's something Amberlynn Quamelina talks a lot about as well. She's very passionate about the ideas of not only the gender imbalance, but how that then translates to other marginalised voices, and it kind of just keeps getting smaller and smaller. I guess I want to talk a little bit about this idea that we have of feminism or equality or gender bias or any of these kind of buzzwords being about boys versus girls. Why is it that these stories, by women, about women, by women and about women, are important not only to girls but also to boys?
It's funny, a couple of weeks ago, I've been living overseas in a very remote little island in the South Pacific, but I have a collection of short stories that's on the syllabus for some schools I've been studying, and I arranged a Skype interview with a school. They actually contacted me and asked if it was okay if we set it up, and the kids contacted me because that was the English extension class. So, you can't say no, so we set it up. And it was really fascinating. There were 10 kids in the class, and there were boys and girls, and obviously they'd been told by their teacher to formulate some questions in advance so they could come up and ask me the questions and I could answer them. So it wasn't such a casual discussion, but the questions that the boys asked were so interesting. They were... one of the stories has got a woman in it, and she's feeling the relationship she's in is going wrong because there is nothing between her and her partner. It's just become this kind of colourless thing, and she's wondering what she can do to fix it. And it says he's become brotherly. He doesn't like to hold her hand in public. It's like living with her brother, which I'm sure every female will understand. I think that idea of everything's becoming nullified, and kind of that's towards the end of a relationship. That's what's happening. At the end of the story, she's looking at him, and she, you might know the story. I think it's called Seizure. She witnesses a man being kind to a stranger on the street who's having an epileptic seizure, and it pushes everything else into motion, her dissatisfaction with her own partner. And there's a word she can't think of. There's a word, and I couldn't think of it myself, and it was one of the boys who filled in the word at the end, which is cherish. The word is cherish. But the boys' questions about her, they said, can I ask Andrew in that story of his name, is that guy in the story, is he gay? And I said, no, in a heterosexual relationship, I would say. But I said, what's in the text to make you think that? And he opened up the story and it underlined all the bits that were things like, it was like she would describe it as brotherly, or he wouldn't hold her hand, he never told her how nice she looked, which to me that's what a gay guy does. I don't know much. But for these teenage boys it became instantly something they had to kind of interrogate in the story because it really concerned them. And it was like a kind of a misreading of something that it struck me as they were fascinated by the relationships and wanted to ask me the kind of story behind the story. They all wanted to find out whether I'd lived those experiences or those relationships, boys and girls. But the boys had a different way of asking those questions in terms of, was it some kind of trick that I was doing as a writer in revealing these things? Are these stories actually a whole lot simpler than we think, and we are over-analysing them, maybe? And you didn't meet any of these things or these symbols or these meanings. Is it kind of like something that only some of us are going to get and some of us aren't? It's like it's not like you're tricky. Their way of reading seems quite different to me as well. I don't know whether that's because they're used to reading kind of books by men, which are like, in my experience, mostly teenage boys read kind of thrillers, which are really plot-driven stories, and their TV really kind of mirrors that. And they read kind of lots of science fantasy generally, which are big, fat, immersive experiences of other worlds or other lands or whatever. When it comes to kind of... women's fiction always seems to get disparaged for being domestic, and it always has. It always has. Domestic fiction, it's always domestic. It's, even women's crime, which is a massive, massive field, has always, been categorised, it's a malice domestic, or it's a cosy, or whatever. It's sort of seen as these. So basic human relationships seem to be... that's the thing, that you kind of get... I've found that is the difference. Women
and yet female crime authors, in Australia at the moment, are winning so many awards for experimenting and being adventurous, and, they're doing amazing things in the crime genre.
But it's interesting that with the reading, a couple of things. It's why school environment is so important, because those questions are good questions, and then if you've got a good teaching environment, it's how you can then use that to teach the boys. So I've been very lucky. My girls go to Princess Hill Secondary, which I love that school, and it's interesting coming out of Melbourne University. If I teach boys from Princess Hill, which I do occasionally, I don't know what they do at that school, but by year 12 they seem to get it, and they're great boys to teach, and I think something happens at that school. But it is interesting, Kate, because it's hard when I say you can't win as a female writer sometimes, because one of the things about Anne Enright that my male students, they get angry with Anne Enright. One is because her women usually choose when they're going to pick up a bloke and when they're going to dump him. When the bad sex weekend, this guy looks great on Friday night, but by the time Sunday morning comes, you can't wait to get rid of him. He starts to smell and stuff.
And she is the agent of the action.
So they get angry at Anne Enright's characters, but the general consensus in that why does she have to castrate all her male characters? I said, well, she's not castrating. She's just saying, I've had enough. Can you go? But if that was a bloke saying, I'm going to have a wild weekend, the character, and he picks up a woman, has a wild weekend, and then he goes back to his wife on the Sunday, well, again, that's another form of normal. Whereas these sassy women who pick and choose, there's real anxiety. Having said that, when you can open up that discussion in the group of students, you can really, as a teacher, you can really go somewhere with that and end up being something really vital to the students.
And that's when it changes, isn't it? When you can actually take that stuff and kind of unpack it and talk about what is domestic. Relationships are domestic, relationship-driven stories and narratives. It's always about the relationships. I think we're all fascinated by them, but we have this other diet, don't we? We have the kind of John le Carré diet or the Matthew Riley diet or whatever, where we have this kind of... boys don't want to go there. But it does seem to me the teenagers, that you were saying about your daughters, and looking at that fantastic clip of what happens to those teenage girls that makes them so... It's fight like a girl. Where does that come from, that thing? How has that leached into our consciousness?
Yet, it has. And I think it's interesting, because I think a lot of this discussion ties into what we as a whole, without blaming anybody, because that's part of it being unconscious, it's what we're telling boys and girls that they have the opportunity to become. So, we're telling girls that they fight like a girl and they run like a girl, but we're telling boys as well that, you're reluctant readers, you like boy books and you like sport books and you like non-fiction, and there's a danger in that too. Leanne, you've worked for years as a specialist bookseller, specialising in young adult, and you write young adult fiction. So what have you seen about that, that message that's coming through not only when we're saying those direct things to boys and to girls, but when we're giving girls books with girly covers and boys books with boyish covers, and we're pitching them a blurb and that kind of thing? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Firstly, reading is still, I feel, a more acceptable activity for a teenage girl than it is for a teenage boy. There's a lot of stigma, I think, still attached with boys amongst their friends to be seen carrying around a book and reading it too much. It's not the most acceptable of hobbies to have. So I do think that reading at that age is seen as a female activity to a certain extent. Look, I I've actually changed my opinion about when I was a bookseller. I felt like I would have said that teenage boys tend to go for the more action thriller, crime genres, and girls tend to go for more romances or relationship or drama or friendship dramas. But I would actually say, having gone into a lot of schools regularly to do talks and workshops over the last 5 or 6 years, I actually feel like I'm seeing less of that you could say that this genre or that genre is preferred by males or females. I feel like I've had a lot of my preconceptions blown out of the water by seeing what young girls are reading at the moment and what young boys are reading. There seems to be less distinction between the two these days. And I think in terms of discussing book covers, I mean, there are obviously covers that are very strongly marketed to a particular gender, but I think my experience of being in schools and having my book cover and talking to the students is that the biggest barrier for teenagers is what genre they think the book is, not whether the author is male or female, or whether they think the cover is girly or not girly. I mean, some covers are so girly that it prevents any boys from picking it up. But it's more the perception about what genre it is. And so I'll have girls and boys, after hearing this speak, going, "Oh, Miss, I had no intention of reading your book, but now that I've heard you talk about it, I think I'm going to read it now." And so the perception before I've talked has been that it's a romance, a romantic book. And then after I talk to the kids, the perception is that it's an action book. And I get boys and girls responding to that.
I think that's something that came out in the Melbourne Writers' Festival session as well. We showed a bunch of covers to the students in the room. And one of them, I don't know if you're all familiar with the book Scarlet, which is part of a science fiction fantasy quartet. And it's got like a reddish pink cape on the cover, and I held it up and asked the audience who would read it, and there were about 4 or 5 hands and not one of them was a boy. And then I said, it's science fiction, it's futuristic, there's a cyborg, there's an alien invasion, and there were a lot more hands that went up, both girls and boys. And so I think that while the reading habits of students are certainly changing and they are becoming, I mean, who knows if it's more open-minded or if they actually always have been that open-minded, but I think that there is still an element of, prestige and marketing bias and what they're being told that they're allowed to read and peer pressure and that kind of thing. Tony, have you seen that? I mean, you were a reader at school.
I was going to ask a question. Do people know the book Snakebite? No. By a Canberra author, and she's a female author. I'm really sorry that her name escapes me, but I actually was walking past a tent at the Byron Festival last year and she was about to talk and I stopped. And Snakebite is a YA almost adult novel, and listening to her talk, it was really challenging. It was about youth culture in Canberra and about the sort of the underside of youth culture, so there's sex, drugs, rock and roll in it. And the cover, it's interesting, had someone with a tat, and it looks really urban and earthy. Because the question I wanted to ask, I suppose, I bought the book and gave it to my daughter Nina, who was then 15. She read it and she goes, "Oh, there's some really wild stuff in here." And then she gave it to a mate of hers from school and she read it, and it sort of got passed around. And I realised, well, there's some pretty challenging stuff in there, but that was great because it excited her. And is there any role with the covers or choices? Do parents intervene in either positive or negative ways around that sort of reading habits of kids at that age, where a parent might approve or disapprove of a book that a kid would buy? Or would a teenage girl feel inhibited about buying a book that maybe her parents wouldn't approve of? Or
I find that it's the parents and grandparents and adults that are generally the ones that go, "Oh, this looks like a girl's book. I don't think he's going to read that." I mean, it's not really the teenagers. In my experience, it was more the older generations that were the ones that were kind of cabazzing my suggestions on the basis that it looked too girly or too boysy. I mean, I do find gendered marketing ridiculous, and I hate the idea of girls' Lego and all that sort of thing. But really, would it be so bad for a boy to be seen reading a pink book with flowers on it? I don't know that it does. The book covers do annoy me, but maybe instead of changing the book covers, we should just make a whole class of Year 10 boys carry around a pink book with them all week and read it on the tram and then report back at the end of the week about what happened to them. I mean...
Well, they do that in prisons. There is a teacher doing that. Well, there's a teacher, a primary school teacher that I was recently introduced to is doing something called the Publisher Challenge. Are you Maddie? Hi, nice to meet you. And I hope that I'm doing your idea justice, but what Maddie is doing is challenging students to read gendered books, and so it almost gives them permission, I suppose, to be reading books that they wouldn't normally, based on those kind of ideas and pressures and prejudices. Let's talk about the perks of a prize. I mean, you guys are all prize winners. What has winning a prize or, winning an award or being recognised, what has that done for your writing? I mean, especially you, Leanne and Cate, as women who have won prizes for your books.
For me, it was huge to win a prize because I'd worked in a bookshop for so many years. I realised that your book only really has like a month where it is going to be face out, multiple copies on the bookshelf. And if your book is a really big seller, it might get a second month face out in a nice stack in the bookstore, and after that you are one or two thin spines on the shelf forevermore. And it's very easy to slip off the shelf completely and not get reordered. And so for me, winning a prize, which really, the process of me getting published was really not that much different from getting picked out of a slush pile. It just happened to be that it was a prize pool, has been that it just distinguished my book a little bit from others when there are so many published every month. It just gave me a little bit more attention than that I would have received otherwise.
I have to say, apart from sometimes there's prize money attached, which is a really great thing when you're a writer. I'm not going to disparage that. It's fantastic to win a prize for that reason. But one of the great things is actually your book might be picked to be on a school syllabus. I can't tell you how wonderful it is to think that is going to be your audience, that you're going to be able to write and have your book looked at by a dedicated teacher who's interested in reading and passionate about... We overuse that word so much. We have, the two words like passionate and journey. I just think, oh, God. But I feel very passionate about writing, and I love talking about story, and I love talking to kids about story, because no one ever came to my school at all. We never had a visitor. I never met a writer or an actor or a musician or anyone until I got to university. There was just nothing. It just seemed to not exist. And so I couldn't... That thing we were just saying before about how do we do it to make kids, or to stop kids doing that self-oppressing thing, we have to be models. We have to model somehow. And you know what kids are like. Kids don't do what you say. Kids do what you do. Kids are going to do what you do. So if you're that inspired and inspiring teacher, or you're that inspired and inspiring writer, or even just someone who's sitting on the tram reading a book, and that is it's very positive. So I think if you can win a prize and actually increase or sort of widen your readership, if it gets down to that because your book's got a prize winner sticker on the cover and it means that you might be read by more young people, that's a pretty good reason to get back to the desk, I think. I really like that.
And why is it important to you specifically to be read by young people? Let's talk about, we're here to launch the schools program, so why is it important that, that
for me,
young people
it's
read
because I want young people to understand, and this is the question I often get from young people, a little bit like I was saying before. I want them to understand that that this is not just something that's been manufactured to be consumed. One of the many things that they kind of is forced upon them, merchandise that they sort of can munch over or sample or listen to for 10 minutes on their phone. Someone has thought about this and shaped this. This is a story that has been made for you, with you in mind. A lot of students, when I say to young people who are keen writers, and I say, why do you write? Invariably they say, to explore my emotions or to express my emotions. And I always say, that's awesome, that is fantastic, but something else happens when you want to become a writer, and that is you stop thinking about exploring your emotions and you start thinking about making something for someone else's emotional response. And it's wonderful to to meet with students, to actually be able to explain to them, I'm thinking about you, I'm making something for you, and it's a labour of love to make it for you, and you can do this too. This is the kind of work that you can think about doing, to think about yourself in relation to other people, in all kinds of work and writing work they do, in terms of writing an essay, in terms of doing any kind of compositional work in school. Think about the person you're writing for. Think about the connection you want to make with that person. That in itself is a fantastic educational experience. And you have to learn that by doing it, you know, to create empathy and compassion. Gee, we could do a bit more of that, I think, in the world.
Can I say a couple of quick things? One of the things that is so pertinent to what Cate just said, I came from a workshop today with older people, and one of the things that people were doing is a woman, they decided the form that they would use was the letter to their grandchildren. This is older Australians who are concerned about climate change and global warming, writing a letter to their grandchildren about their future. And what was clear about that is the notion of how important the letter was as a form of communication, which we're sort of losing, because it's saying it's someone has taken time and care to addressing this to someone personal. People respond to that in a way which is much more intimate and absorbing than a text or an email. So the process, the labour of writing, the craft of writing is something that we knew, and we hope that we don't lose inherently. So the idea was, if these women want to write letters to their granddaughters, that form is the best form to use to communicate it. So that's pertinent to what Cate said. The other thing I'd say, one of the pleasures of being a judge on the Stella is that, and this goes to the credit of the board and the people responsible for it, and it certainly goes to this project with the schools kit, is that this award, I haven't won a prize actually. I've been shortlisted I think 6 times now. It's like never winning an Academy Award, but I've been involved in several also as a judge.
You'd be winning a Tony.
What's incredible about this award is so quickly how much it's become a discussion about, into the wider culture. So it's truly been educative in that truly cultural way. So people are getting great insight into a debate which, as your quote said, I don't know if it would never have happened, but it has brought the debate into the fore a lot more quickly and out of necessity than it would have occurred. So it's an award that has so much more kudos, I think, because of the way it's been seen now as something that's not only for the prize winners, which is vital. It's not only for the shortlisted writers. It's about that basic question: why is the writing by women so important to Australian culture? And that's the great discussion that people are having.
Absolutely. We've got some time, so does anybody have any questions? Yes, we'll go here first and then at the front here.
So I'm Madeline. I'm the teacher who's making her kids walk around with pink books.
That is such a great idea.
Well done.
So I teach grade 2s, and the way that I got them to do that was I told them the publisher doesn't want them to read those books. So basically that's what you do to a grade 2. But so then my question is, is there going to be a Stella Schools program for primary schools?
That is a very good question. Stella, people at the back, do have an answer for that?
You talk so much about how early it comes.
Yeah.
And I see it all the time in my grade 2s.
Yep.
So my grade 2s, when I read them a book, it doesn't matter who it's by. They love the literature that I present them with. But when we go to the library and it's their time to borrow, which is why I started what I started, they go for the gendered covers so much more than other books. So they'll go for authors that I recommend, but they'll go for Go Girl and Billy B. Brown and Zach Power, really strongly gendered books. So then I worry, what are we doing for primary school children before they get to high school, before these things become entrenched, where my children are so willing to take on the publisher's challenge, but before I put that to them, they were choosing gender. It's happened so early. Yeah. So I don't know.
I just say I'll agree with that, because one of the inspirations for the program was Emily Maguire, who does a lot of writing workshops with primary school kids. Says it's incredible how soon boys will only write male protagonists, girls will write across, they can write boys and girls in their stories, but at primary school already, boys will only write stories with boys in the lead. So we would love to start it at a younger age. It's a discussion that needs to happen before secondary school, we absolutely agree. So watch this space.
Yes.
Can I ask a question to Ms. Stella down there, who's also a publisher? It's interesting because people are talking about covers. Is there... I know, when they take your books out to the bookshops and they test out covers, wonder what you think of either about the role of publishers here, about getting them to think in other ways about covers other than sort of, a focus group.
Look, that's how unconscious bias works. Everyone plays into it. Publishers are marketers too. So Pink Lego, you can't market a film like Tangled. You can't call it, you can't give it a female name. Brave. You've got to hide that you've got a female protagonist the way you can. Publishers are just as complicit. They want to make money. They know that if you create niches, you can build markets for boys, for girls. So I work in publishing. I know that's part of the problem too. It needs to be addressed by booksellers. Play into the game too. There's a lot of, we have lots of evidence that booksellers know that men tend to only read books by men, and so they hand sell male books to them. So it happens at all levels. So it's booksellers, it's publishers, it's schools, it's the media. It's
quite a circular thing, isn't it? It all feeds into each other. Hi, Loris.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, and this is either a good or a bad thing, but a lot of the schools and the students and the teachers don't know the gender of authors, because I was thinking it's an example of a book by J.C. Birch. It's a fantastic book called The Story of Tom Brennan. So it's about a teenage boy, about a country town and about a car accident. That school is studied really widely in schools, and it's interesting because J.C. Birch is actually Jane Birch, but the publisher had always advised her to use her initials because it is the book appeals to both sexes, but that book's been really popular. And she said quite often when she gets to schools, the kids and the teachers are quite surprised to find J.C. Birch. And this follows like all the crime writers, P.D. James's. And so it is a bit of a ploy by the publishers, but in some way it's had a positive outcome. We do masses of bookings for Jane Birch, and they soon do find out, obviously, that she's a woman. But it is a bit of a circular thing that initially the publishers did persuade her to hide her femininity.
That's right. Identity. And the initial thing certainly has, a whole discussion around it. I mean, look at J.K. Rowling. Her first crime book was written under a male pseudonym. You've got to wonder at those choices as well.
When I was at Catholic school, we had to cover all of our books in brown paper wrapping anyway, in case we managed to damage them or we got some idea perhaps from the cover that wasn't appropriate. I think we should go back to that. I think schools should put all of their kids' books.
Or publishers.
Yeah.
Which is only publish brown paper cover books.
I might even write a book called Brown Paper Wrapping by C. Kennedy. And let's
just by CK, just do away with any identifying features at all. Is there a question? Do you still have a question here, sir?
Thank you. I have two questions. One relates to the curriculum. And the curriculum is obviously set by a group of people. So what discussions take place, or what interaction is there between writers and the curriculum people to ensure that there's a greater awareness of the very points that you're raising? The second relates to publishers, and that is the publishers obviously have an enormous influence. So how do you then convince the publishers that they have to take a stronger stand in terms of addressing the needs of the author, of the gender issues, in order to ensure that they're not biased in terms of their bottom line that perhaps says there is a better return on investment on male-oriented books?
I guess just in terms of getting the books on the curriculum, I know that the Stella Prize has already started discussions with the people who set the curriculum and are trying to get more books. Obviously, Kate, one of your books is already on the curriculum, thankfully, trying to get more books on there. The other issue, I guess, is that there are school book lists, and so school reading lists, and so part of the idea of rolling out a program like the schools program and having a launch like this is to start those discussions so that, teams and individuals who have influence in setting those school lists can take these ideas back to the schools and start suggesting based on that. Did you have a comment on that point?
I actually chair the panels that set the VC text list. I work at the VCAA. And I just was going to add, we have a public nomination process which has only been running for 2 years, and we would love to have more nominations from people about the books that they'd like to see on the lists. I would like to point out, not to be defensive, because I wholeheartedly accept the points and take full responsibility for our role in setting female authors, but the literature text list is 60% women.
Yes.
The other thing, just to jump in on the publisher's point, is one challenge that we have had is you would imagine that a good chunk of the lists have to be kind of fairly canonical kinds of texts. So we do have a role in setting newer texts, and Burial Rites is one we've set for next year's list. But one challenge we've had is that a lot of the more classic Australian female authors have gone out of print. For example, just today I was looking for some short story collections. Gillian Mears, Thea Astley, all gone out of print. So something like The Man Who Loved Children's only just come back into print only after a couple of years ago, but had been out of print for a number of years. The Lost Dog. So there's something a challenge that we face in wanting to set more canonical or classic, for want of a better word, authors that we can't actually get access to them. So interested to know from that publisher. Feel bad for them being the only rep here, but.
Yes, Mike.
Hello. Just a PS on the authors in print. I was very excited to see this week that Olga Masters' stories have come back into print. I think I'm not sure who the publisher is doing it. It's not Text, but they're fantastic.
I mean, that's interesting, Mike, because we had an email sent to us at Melbourne Uni about that new release, and goes back to the board, is that, and one of the great initiatives with Stella, of course, is at Year 12, it's important to get, you want people who can write study notes, resources, so that accompanying a book is a lot of material that then can be supplement the book. I know some of my books are taught at Year 11 level, so schools can set their own texts. But part of the Year 12 gig is also about the sort of resources you can provide. And I know with the Masters re-release, that'll be absolutely front and centre to make sure that when teachers are looking at Olga Masters' collection, that there'll be plenty of material to go out there. It's probably also one of the things that maybe, I don't know if Stella has done this, Aviva, but going out to the annual teachers' conferences to talk to English teachers about what you're doing, is that, again, once they often see, you're introduced to some of those teachers, there's a lot of follow-up where teachers from individual schools will want you to come out and talk to their kids and meet a writer at 16 rather than at 26. And it's another issue there is getting young female students access to those younger female writers in the school system.
That's right. And look, I mean, certainly I don't think the idea of any of this is to point blame at any one person. I mean, obviously you guys setting the text are working with what you have, and there's responsibility for everybody, for the publishers, for the readers, for the teachers. And I mean, I've worked with hundreds of teachers who are really, really passionate about getting as many new ideas and as many relevant issues into their students as possible. So, it certainly is about starting the discussion and offering strategies, not suggesting that any one person is responsible for this whole thing. We've probably got time for one more question if there is one.
I was just going to chip in with something that Quish was to say. Thank you so much for coming along, and also to say to your point about the canon, that sort of a lot of what makes the canon is something that's won prizes, and so that goes back to sort of the issue of why the Stella Prize is set up, and that hopefully that if what gets onto school lists is things that have been recognised and awarded, then here we have an award, and hopefully that will mean that when we think of what the Australian canon is, that a lot more female writers come to mind. But I also agree with you that it's important to have things in print, and I think something like what the Text Classic series has done has brought a lot of that back, and that's fantastic as well. So it's a push on a lot of fronts. But thank you for your support and just too.
Do we have a final question? Yes, Mike.
I just wanted to say something that Kate said really resonated with me, is that part of the the work and the conversation, I think, within schools is around teaching ways of reading, teaching ways of thinking about books, teaching ways to talk about books, teaching ways to explore books. And that's something I know is a huge challenge in schools, and something that I'd love to see more and more of. So, hopefully the Stella is part of that discussion.
Well, look, maybe that's a nice point to finish on, and I can just do a quick plug for these notes. If any of you don't have a copy, please grab one on the way out, and if you know any other schools or teachers who might like one, then spread the word. They're available in hard copy and will soon be available to download. But one of the things that we've tried to do with this is not only offer specific notes for the texts on the shortlist of the prize for both years, which will probably appeal to the audience of both of your books, but also to offer a list of reading questions that students can use. And I imagine, Maddie, that this is possibly an idea that you could take into primary schools at this early stage, to start really critically evaluating their reading habits. So, what pulls them towards books, why they read the way they do, how they're influenced by gender issues. So, I guess to finish up in an echo of where we started, it's really about starting those discussions, not only between everybody here, but between students themselves, and getting them to start discussing with themselves and each other why they make the decisions they do and how that influences the way they feel about themselves and each other.
And start writing themselves too.
That's right,
because that's
exactly.
the most powerful thing they will ever be able to take, is to make something out of what's happening to you in your life. That's when you start seeing change happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, well, thank you everybody so much for coming, and thank you all for joining me.